Welcome to Small Talk with the Lees. I'm your host, Brandon Lee, and co-host Justin Lee, and we're joined by Alejandro and Andre. And we're four Mormons discussing the topics in the CES letter, or in this case, a topic that's not discussed in the CES letter, but could be the smoking gun. So we're going to talk about Deutero-Isaiah, which is basically the problem of an anachronism that Isaiah isn't actually written by Isaiah, yet it's quoted in the Book of Mormon many times when Lehi couldn't possibly have known about it if it's true that it wasn't written by Isaiah. And so we're going to get into very technical details here. I'm actually recording this after we just finished our recording. And so it's like a 3-hour session. I'm going to say I think the 3 hours was necessary to really understand the arguments here and flesh them out from both the apologetic side and the argumentative side. And it's not a debate just in Mormonism, but it's actually one that's debated between evangelicals and liberal Christians. So the problem of Deutero-Isaiah is not one unique to Mormonism. That being said, we provide some ways to analyze this as a faithful Mormon, and also to do it in an intellectually honest way, such as the examples of Abraham Gileadi, B.H. Roberts, and Grant Hardy. So we discuss their views as well as other views presented by David Bokovoy and other biblical scholars. And you're going to get a really comprehensive outlook and understanding of these issues. If you want to look into the specific details of them, the PowerPoint is going to be posted in some form, maybe a Google Doc, with the podcast description. And you can look at the specific scripture verses and look them up on your own time. So that being said, you're in for a treat. The first part's going to be an introduction to the Deutero-Isaiah problem, and the second part will be an entire systematic outlook at the main arguments for and against multiple authorship of the Book of Isaiah. So, arguments for and against multiple Isaiah authorship and with the rebuttal. So the way I structured this is, for example, I have an argument listed in white. That means the argument is either for or the argument is against multiple authorship. And then I have the rebuttal from the other side underneath it. Okay, so these are arguments for multiple authorship of the Book of Mormon. So this would be like a biblical scholar arguing, hey, Isaiah is written by multiple people. Okay, so the first argument is that, just like we were talking about earlier, is that these arguments have actually been brought up for a long time. This is nothing new. As far as 12th century AD, so what is that, like 900 years plus? Okay. This Jewish rabbi, famous Talmudic, sorry, I'm going to bash the pronunciation, Talmudic scholar, was the first one to express any doubt that, hey, maybe Isaiah is not just written by Isaiah. Okay. And at first there was kind of this counter argument to this that said that, yeah, but then the Jews decided that that was a heresy. And so I asked my friend, the biblical scholar, who is a Jew doing Mormon studies, and he said that in Judaism, they don't actually have heresies. That's a Christian word. That's a Christian tradition, you know. And so that's not entirely accurate. That it's a Jewish heresy to think that.
Because in the Jewish tradition, everybody's arguing all the time.
Yep. So there's no heresy.
Is there any? I mean, so where does that argument come from then? What?
That comes from Naked Bible podcast. So these are Christians talking about this. So I would just guess that they got that wrong.
Is it like a blasphemy?
No,
they had no source for that when they said it. They were just saying it.
Yeah, they don't have a source. So that's just wrong to say that this is a heresy. So I'm guessing if you ask Jews what they think about the Book of Isaiah authorship, it would probably depend on what type of Jew you ask, you know, like liberal or Orthodox or whatever, and they would have different answers for this question. That's the best of my guess for that. The next argument in favor of multiple authorship is that, so once again, so it was kind of articulated well into an argument about 200 plus years ago by some German scholars. So this is kind of the birth of, also, it takes place around the same time of the birth of higher criticism and biblical scholarship around the 18th century in Germany. The response to this from the other side would be that this is kind of a Chesterton argument. Hey, you know, these biblical scholars, they're really smart, But when you look at their conclusions, it's like, how did you get from point A to point B? Okay, so that would be the rebuttal to that. Okay, the next arguments in favor of the Book of Isaiah being written by multiple people is that, hey, look at Isaiah 40 versus previous, Isaiah 1 through 39. There's this shift in the whole context, because it's going from talking about Assyria, which we know the Assyrians had already, when Isaiah was preaching to the Jews, okay, that's an anachronistic word right now, but when Isaiah was preaching to the southern kingdom, right, the northern kingdom had been destroyed by Assyria already. Okay, and so Isaiah's referencing all this destruction about Assyria, and then suddenly when you go to Isaiah 40, there's this transition like this. Okay, it's talking about Cyrus and the Persians, and we know Cyrus was king of Persia, who took over southern Judah, the southern kingdom of the Jews, and that was way later. That Isaiah died before Cyrus showed up in the picture, right? Cyrus wasn't even born when Isaiah was alive. Okay, so that's one of the main. It's like the whole context.
One of the evidences.
Is different. Sorry, what?
That's like what? That's like part of the evidence for multiple authorship.
Right. Because if you have this whole switch, right? If you're mentioning Cyrus, then Cyrus wasn't around when Isaiah was around, and so that's probably more than likely a different author, right? So there's multiple authors. And so the argument against that would be, hey, well, who's to say Isaiah couldn't just have prophesied the name Cyrus and gotten it right? Okay. So that's the prophetic rebuttal. The next argument in favor of multiple scholarship is that thematic shift. Okay. So not only is there a whole context, the what and the where, and that's not the only thing that's shifting here. There's this theme that's shifting from Isaiah 1, first Isaiah to second Isaiah, okay? And that theme is a shift of the book of Isaiah talking about judgment. Judgment is coming. You guys are being stupid. You guys are going to be destroyed or punished if you don't repent, okay? And then suddenly there's a shift in the theme, and it's saying you'll be forgiven. There's reconciliation. Don't worry. Take comfort. It's a very comforting section, second Isaiah. It's all about comfort, okay? And a further point that David Bokovoy makes here is that Isaiah is believed to have this belief called the inviolability of Jerusalem, which basically means that the city of Zion or Jerusalem cannot be destroyed. God will not let it be destroyed, okay? And so that, if Isaiah wrote 40 through 66, then it wouldn't make sense, because Isaiah would be having his own type of faith crisis where he's like, wait, I thought God wouldn't destroy his own city or wouldn't let it happen. And yet here he's writing, there's all this destruction. And so it doesn't even seem to match Isaiah's kind of beliefs, let's say. So again, the rebuttal to all this would be that, Isaiah wasn't speaking as himself. He was speaking as a prophet. So he could have prophesied all of this destruction 100 plus years.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Peter, for example, Peter was told, like, don't preach the gospel to people that aren't the Jews. And then he changed, right? Revelation happened, he changed, and his ideas shifted. Is that part of, can that be part of the argument as well?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what I was saying about faith crisis is, yeah, he would have to have a major change in his views in order for that to happen. Right. So that's the argument that the other side would make. So, okay. We're going to talk a little bit more about this prophetic view, though, in the next section. So the next argument is references to Jerusalem being destroyed and using the word desolation. So it seems you can go and read Isaiah 40 through 66 and just read it yourself. And every time you see this word desolation or destruction and stuff, ask yourself, is this being portrayed as something that is happening or something that did happen?
What about
will happen? Sorry, something that will happen. Is it something that's being predicted, or is it something that's being described right now?
What did that depend a lot on the person who was translating it, though?
as far as the Hebrew would go and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So like translating it from the Hebrew to
Well,
English.
Well, if
Yeah.
that were the case, then you would see variation in the various translations, but they're all pretty much the same. So I don't think it's a translation issue.
You're saying there would be future tense words
Right.
in
In this
second
desolation.
Isaiah, but there would be present tense words in first Isaiah. Is that kind of what you guys are saying?
Yeah, yeah. So it just
Mhm.
depends on what the translator was getting at.
Right. So I don't know the specific answer to that question because I can't read the original language. I know that argument is not made by people defending unitary authorship, or at least I haven't stumbled upon it. So I would say that there's no evidence for that.
Although, yeah, and I would actually like to look at that as well, because I've heard a lot of things that there's, I've heard that there's rhyming in Isaiah, and that he would pick certain words because they rhymed with each other and because they were like poetic.
Mhm.
And so I guess one of my questions would be, does his style of writing change, like his poeticism? And the only way to really know that would be to actually read the Hebrew and to know what his style would be. But nobody really argues.
And I think Avraham Gileadi is the one that argues that he threw it all into a computer and it says that, hey, it's all the same style. So you do have arguments for the style being the same, of course.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because, yeah, and I think part of the reason that they would do that is because a lot of these things were, only certain people would have the written text. You can't mass produce written text.
Mm-hmm.
And so, part of this like oral teaching, you have to have it in a poetic way that can be taught across lots of people. So I think that would be a major part of this, right? That how it's written is in order to convey towards mass crowds or generations, maybe even,
Yeah. Well, so that's what I don't know the specifics. I would be very interested to read the original text as well, but that's kind of what the biblical scholars are doing, right? And so when the biblical scholars are studying, that's their whole job, is to spend hours on day and analyzing the differences in the text. And then so when they come up with this theory that, hey, it is different authors, that's including all of this study about the style and the work.
Okay, so then I have another question. So the biblical scholars, are they usually coming from a Christian perspective? Are there, I think, did you mention some Jewish scholars that would have? Because we attended that conference with Judaism at BYU. They talk about how they argue things all the time, right? Within themselves. Do you know of any Jewish scholar that's looking at that and saying, hey, this looks like 2 or 3 different authors?
Yeah, I don't. Good question. I don't know about
because if it's coming from like a like an English perspective, then I wonder if that impacts it at all with.
Oh, for certain. Yeah, so when David Bokovoy is talking about this, he actually mentions a lot of Hebraisms versus Aramaisms. So he's talking about how, hey, you know what? This later portion is actually written using Aramaic words. And the first portion isn't written in Aramaic, let's say. And we know that the Jews didn't start speaking in Aramaic until later, right? And so he uses that as evidence that, hey, this is definitely something written later, because how did they speak Aramaic back then, right? Isaiah didn't speak Aramaic. And but the complexity of that argument is very complex.
That's something that I would have to
scholars or later edit.
I'd have to argue that as well, because like Nephi, whenever he's talking, he says, this is preserving the language of my fathers, right? And so is there a possibility that there's multiple languages being spoken and there's like this purity of language?
Well, there was no Aramaic back in Isaiah's time. That was much later.
I see.
Continuing the speculation, I mean, is it possible that there was an original, like from chapter 50 to 66 or whatever, and then the Aramaic, those that did speak it, look at that, and then they made a new text for it for that second part, and they.
Right, and that would be the reason why such an argument made by David Bokovoy would be one of the same level as, let's say, Gileadi's, where he's throwing stuff into a computer and saying, hey, it's all the same style, right? Because you can make all sorts of deeper arguments about, hey, well, maybe that was a later edit, and originally it was Isaiah, and then these people speaking Aramaic ended up changing it and stuff. So you can go in all sorts of circles with the language style arguments. So it's an interesting question, but I don't think that can resolve this debate specifically.
And when we're looking at different things, we talk about Joseph Smith's testimony of the first vision and how if you write to a different audience, then your style of teaching, your style of telling a story will change. And so maybe the original people that he was speaking to, he had this very hopefulness for Jerusalem. And then, he maybe was speaking to a different audience and had a very, disdain and
See, but the problem is he uses the word, or whoever uses it, uses the word desolation, destruction, the waste places. And we know that's most likely, almost certainly, specifically referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, the waste places, right? You've read the Book of Mormon, so you know it uses these words, same with Isaiah.
Right.
What else could it be talking about, the waste places, right? We know that around 35, 39, it's talking about the Syrian destruction, Babylon and stuff. Not Babylon, sorry. But from 40 on, there's a very strong argument to be made, and you just have to read the text, is that it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and Babylon. And so that if you accept that, then you can't be making the argument that he's talking to a different audience unless you're saying he's doing it from a prophetic perspective where he's predicting in the future what's going to happen. Right? These can't be people during the time of Isaiah.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of speculation there because I think if I was, because different audiences, I mean, even though you have people from Jerusalem.
But which audience has waste place? Which audience would he be trying to comfort and saying, hey, it's okay. This place is going to be rebuilt again.
So, okay.
He's not talking to the northern kingdom because they're gone, right? Assyria took them away.
Assyria took them.
Isaiah is a prophet in the southern kingdom, and they haven't been destroyed yet. So who else is he going to be comforting?
Oh, that's interesting. The thing that I know about the Assyrians, I think, if I remember right, the Assyrians had this way of taking over that they would try to assimilate their culture onto the Judah, the tribe of Judah as well, right? And so they would lose their traditions and things like that at the same time. So I'm wondering if, I don't know. I'd have to look more into that. That's an interesting theory.
Because just imagine yourself as like Lehi, let's say, right? Because he was around the time of Isaiah. And so if Isaiah's preaching, hey, it's okay, look around you, there's these waste places, but it's okay because everything's going to be okay because God's going to come and he's going to make it all better. So this is a message of comfort, right? If you're Lehi, that's not going to make sense to you because you're looking around like Laban and you're saying, hey, everything's fine, right?
Right.
There's no destruction here. That's the northern kingdom.
Right.
And so that's kind of the argument that the biblical scholars are making, is that if you are to interpret this as a prophetic view, it just doesn't make sense. So here's the quote, okay? It strains the imagination to believe that Isaiah addressed these theological debates about a Gentile Messiah some 150 years before they took place, and that his response to those debates was copied and recopied for many years by scribes and read by audiences who could not have made heads or tails out of Isaiah's rhetoric. It is more sensible to conclude then that the prophet's words did not predict these debates so much as presupposes them. But he's basically he's saying what I'm trying to say what he's saying. Sorry, that was confusing, right? Is that if you're the southern Jews at the time, in the southern kingdom, what Isaiah is saying is not going to make any sense to you. So he can't be talking to this audience. It just doesn't make sense, right? It would be like Joseph Smith. What would it be like? Brigham Young talking about, hey, there's going to be a lot of look around you, all these people attacking the family. They're trying to get gay marriage passed, right? You say, oh well, either Brigham Young is predicting the future, or one thing's for sure, he's not talking to 19th century Mormons, right? Because they weren't dealing with that problem then.
So to be clear then, Brandon, what you're saying is that the best possible rebuttal to that for the apologetics is that Isaiah is simply prophesying what's in the future, but he's not talking to his current audience.
Yeah, that's basically the best that the other side can do. So,
but
in
it's
my
a
opinion,
political.
that's a weak argument. But sure.
But he's prophesying a political like event or like that hasn't happened yet, a political tension that hasn't happened yet.
Right. So then the question would be, why is he making prophecies for something so specific? Like, what's the point, I guess? Right? And I think this kind of has to go with Alejandro. He's been posting a lot. You've been posting a lot.
He always posts a lot.
That's true. Alejandro, are you still here? I can't see your face. But...
Oh, I am still here, yeah.
Sorry. I think this goes along with what Alejandro's been talking about. We always think that prophets are prophesying in the past, but really what they're trying to do is talk about very specific political or spiritual issues in their own time and saying, for example,
right.
First Isaiah is saying, if you guys don't repent, you're going to be destroyed, right? It's a judgment themed story. And so he's talking very specifically to his people.
Well, yeah, I want to remember that. Alejandro, can you summarize that? I think you posted something about prophets and how their initial thing is not to tell the future.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely summarize it. So Oxford, I can't remember which author, I can pull it up in a minute. This is a book published by Oxford University Press. Let me pull up the reference because I was not, well, I don't have it on hand because I wasn't expecting to.
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh,
I'll just say while you're pulling that up, this view, though, that Alejandro is about to present is not necessary to accept multiple scholarship of Isaiah. And so that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that whether or not you believe in prophecy still actually does not play a strong enough role to make this decision on multiple authors or not.
Okay, and then I think Gileadi would disagree with that, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So this is actually a book called Biblical Prophecy. Its author is Stephen L. McKenzie. This is Oxford University Press. He basically argues in this book that for modern Christians, there's a misunderstanding about what prophecy is. We tend to confuse it with like fortune telling or foretelling, where a prophet will predict the future and say, oh, in this many years, X, Y, and Z will occur. He argues in his book that prophecy wasn't so much about foretelling, but rather it was about telling forth. And what he means by that is you have to understand that for the ancient Israelites, history sort of unfolded and progressed, and you participated in that, in its progression and its outcome. And so, you kind of have to understand that for them, sin means missing the mark. And so if they sense that their society is off course or they're, going to miss the mark, it's up to the prophet to get them back on course. And so prophecy is sort of like a cultural criticism. It can involve foretelling, but its function is to point out that, hey, we're off course, we need to get back on course, because as history progresses, we're going to end up not where we want to be. And right. So
it's kind of like a prophet is someone that speaks for God, and their prophecy is predicting what negative consequences there might be if we don't correct our path. It's not saying something specifically, this guy named Cyrus is going to appear 150 years later, and here's what he's going to do, right?
So, I mean, that's interesting when it comes to when we're talking about Isaiah, right? He's concerned about the trajectory of the people, right? He's concerned that they're going to receive this destruction, but at the same time, he's hopeful, right? So what do you have to say about that, Brandon? He's like, right. He's concerned, but he's not that concerned, I guess. He's not.
Yeah, and that's all First Isaiah stuff. I think that's the beauty of the message. There's plenty of beauty to be found here. What I'm trying to focus on is this second Isaiah part is saying, look around you. There's all these waste places. Don't worry, it's going to be okay, right? If he's trying to say, hey, you guys got to correct your course or something bad's going to happen, he's not going to say, oh, but guess what? Once it happens, you'll be fine, right? That's not motivating in any way.
Right.
So that sums up like that stylistic shift, right? The content, its thematical content shifts between first and second Isaiah, or Proto and Deutero-Isaiah. And that's why people believe that either like a redactor or some other scribe or something sort of inserted that into the book of Isaiah. Gileadi will explain why his argument is complicated. He's going to argue for that it was written by one Isaiah, but he's also going to answer if there were multiple Isaiahs, why would they include it in the first place? And so Gileadi will go into that, and once we get there, I can expand on that a bit more. But
Okay.
People who argue for multiple authorship will say, look, the thematic content has drastically shifted. It doesn't make sense in the context of first Isaiah, and it's historically anachronistic. Therefore, it's a later writing by a later author, and it was included into the first
And
part.
so Joseph Smith including it would be anachronistically using an anachronism.
Yeah, there you go.
So anachroception. Okay.
Yes.
Let's just run through these points. I think because
Okay.
there's a lot of good points to be made here. So, and then we can stop and talk about them once we get to the against side. How about that? Unless, was there something else you wanted to stop right here, Andre?
I wanted to hear the guy that Alejandro's talking about, his point of view, but
Abraham.
So
Yeah.
we'll-
Okay.
We'll get there. It's just we have to cover this stuff first, or else it won't.
I think I got one more slide. Yeah, one more
Okay.
slide, and then we're at Abraham. Okay.
Okay, great.
okay, so
So let's see. Okay, so yeah, just like we just summed up. So the final part for the multiple authorship theory is that here's a pretty good one, I think, that David Bockerville points out. Okay, Deutero-Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 50 verse 1, shows that he references Jeremiah. Okay, and Jeremiah is another prophet talking about destruction of Jerusalem. Specifically, he references chapter 2 verse 8. And so the question is, well, did Isaiah reference Jeremiah, or did Jeremiah reference Isaiah? And so the point that David Bockerville points out here is that Isaiah references Jeremiah, but Jeremiah shows no knowledge of Isaiah. Specifically, if you go to Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 7 through 9, Jeremiah is debating at the temple whether or not Jerusalem will be destroyed. And so if Jeremiah knew about the writings of Isaiah, he most definitely would have said, hey, look, we have this prophet named Isaiah who's prophesying about here's these waste places, here's this desolation, right? So he definitely would have used it in his argument. And so the fact that Jeremiah does not shows that it's more likely that Isaiah is referencing Jeremiah. So therefore, this second Isaiah part, right, Deutero-Isaiah, comes after Jeremiah. And so that's a argument within the whole biblical Hebrew Bible, right? The other argument here is that Deutero-Isaiah is quoting other exilic, which means when the southern kingdom is carried away to Persia, or to Babylon, sorry, as well as post-exilic, which means after they come back. So Deutero-Isaiah is quoting these passages from both Lamentations and Psalms, specifically Isaiah 40, verse 1, quoting Lamentations chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. This is where he's talking about comfort and stuff, so that fits the comfort theme of Deutero-Isaiah. Again, you see in chapter 62 of Isaiah, it's referencing this sad song in Lamentations. There's another one in Psalms. And so you see all these quotes from Isaiah based off of other works, which is an indication that this second Isaiah and third Isaiah is coming far after this is happening. Okay. So that's just building on the evidence of dating portions of Isaiah later. Okay. All right. So that first argument, this is in favor of a unitary author. So basically, this is against multiple authorship. So I put the word against here because we're talking about against multiple authorship. Basically, what we've been talking about, why is it that all the texts we have, open up your Bible, it says Isaiah at the top, and then you have 66 chapters. It doesn't say second Isaiah or third Isaiah. Wouldn't they have been smart enough to put that? That's basically what this is saying. It's also saying our earliest manuscripts, look at our earliest manuscripts. That's going to be the Dead Sea Scroll. And the Dead Sea Scroll does not split it into part 2 or part 3. Okay. Sorry. Am I doing a different? Sorry, I was actually going off something else. Sorry, this argument right here. So So it's saying the earliest text we have of Isaiah is the Great Isaiah Scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And people like to say, hey, there's no breaks on the page. And David Bokovoy actually points out that's just erroneous because, first of all, look at the end of chapter 33 on the scroll, and there's this little break. There's a line space at the bottom. And so that's an indication, not that second Isaiah begins at chapter 33, but actually even within first Isaiah, there are different portions that were added in later, not all written at the same time. And so there's an example of Isaiah is not one author, okay? The other argument against that would be that even if it was that case that the Great Isaiah Scroll didn't have any divisions, it actually doesn't matter because that was written about 400 years later than when the time frame we're even talking about. So it doesn't have anything to do with it. Okay, it's too far down in the future. This other argument, so this is mostly an evangelical argument, but B.H. Roberts made it too. Open up your New Testament, and it says all the time that Jesus quotes them, the apostles quote them. They say, hey, this is what Isaiah said, and they can't be wrong, right? And so this is more of a biblical inerrancy view where you think that the Bible doesn't have any errors. And so you can actually argue around this and say, hey, you can still believe in biblical inerrancy. It's just that when these authors or Jesus talks about, hey, Isaiah said this, they're not talking about the name of the person Isaiah. They're talking about, hey, the book of Isaiah is talking about this, right? And so you don't have to disbelieve biblical inerrancy necessarily to believe in multiple authorship. Okay.
So you think they knew it as the book of Isaiah?
Oh, in Jesus's time? Almost certainly, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Did they think Isaiah wrote all of it? I would just guess, wild guess. I guess yes. But you don't have to make that statement in order to defend off, let's say, a biblical inerrantist.
Yeah.
Right.
Are there like studies done on the historical Isaiah, like the actual person?
Oh, that's a good question. I bet that is a major field within biblical studies that you can focus the rest of your life on. Yeah.
No thanks.
The metaphorical Isaiah, the historical Isaiah.
Yeah, I almost wonder if the Jews back in Jesus' time, they didn't care about historical Isaiah. If
they cared about Abraham.
Or even the historical Abraham. I wonder if
the interesting thing is because with
they
Abraham,
did.
you know how with Abraham though the charge is that Abraham is fictional and that he was used as the origin story of the creation of the nation of the Jewish people. And so this other argument with Isaiah where they say that, hey, they took the text of Isaiah to Cyrus and said, look at this prophet. He prophesied that you would let us go home. And then Cyrus said, wow, you're right. You guys can go home. There's actually the evidence, this Cyrus cylinder right here is evidence against that. It shows that it's likely that is actually a story that comes later. And they say, this is what happened, right? It's a tradition of how they came back to Jerusalem, but it's not actually accurate. So there's actually a lot of, there's some evidence here from the Cyrus cylinder that the Jews are making tradition up.
Whether they always talk about being descendants of Abraham. So they must have thought that, blood.
I'm a descendant of our founding fathers. I don't know if I'm sorry. I don't know if that's the correct comparison, but that's kind of how I see this parallelism going.
I was just thinking about the scripture where John the Baptist is baptizing, and he says what did he say? God can make these stones sons of Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, but it is talking directly about genealogy, and we do know that genealogy is really important to them. So I think there would be a lot of evidence to say that they do care about the actual historicity of that person.
I'm sure they care. I would dispute that it's accurate, any of that genealogy.
But you would dispute that if it's accurate, like if the genealogy.
Yeah, because we don't. So I think you can go back in the Bible and see how Abraham connects all the way to. Sorry, that's the New Testament. Abraham connecting to Jesus, right? But even in the Bible, you have some genealogy about Abraham, Terah, all those people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, none of that has been shown to be historically accurate among biblical scholars.
I don't even know how you would go about proving that.
Yeah, so the further back you go, probably the less conclusive.
All I know is that they're all related to Genghis Khan somehow.
From DNA studies. Great. But I mean, so that's the thing. So I think this Cyrus cylinder is really interesting though. I mean, I'll just skip to this. So basically there's another argument for single authorship. And that argument is that, hey, there's some pre-exilic references in Second Isaiah, right? So Second Isaiah is talking about idolatry. And we know that after Jerusalem got destroyed, that the Jews stopped worshiping idols and they started turning to Jehovah, let's say, the real God. Okay, so any mention of idols is going to be anachronistic. So it has to actually be dated back to Isaiah's time. This can't be post-exilic.
Jeremiah also talks about idolatry a lot.
But Jeremiah, if I'm correct, right, the destruction hasn't happened yet.
Jeremiah, he actually does. Dude, there's a super interesting, I don't know if you want to take a look at this, but there's a super interesting chapter in Jeremiah. I'd love to take a deeper look, but it talks about this way of worshiping. I think it's Jeremiah chapter 10, somewhere over there. But yeah, it talks about this way of worshiping idols. Super, super interesting. I always looked at it so let me just unload this. So, today we look at the Latin American, or just, in Spain they do this as well, but really in Latin America they do it a lot. They do these like procesiones. Maybe Alejandro knows what I'm talking about. The carrying of these like pieces of wood and these like thematic things, right? And so, but they color them and all sorts of things. And so this is actually a really interesting. Why don't you keep going? I'm actually going to pull that up because it's super interesting. I'm going to share it with you guys.
Sorry, but how does this connect?
Dude, you'll see because they talk about idolatry, and so it's this idea that these, even though something was written so long ago, it can still apply. Like it looks a lot like what we do today. So
okay. So basically, I'll just go back to this then, right? So this argument that there's one author is because quoting idolatry in Second Isaiah would be anachronistic. The problem with that argument is, back to this Cyrus cylinder, is that the people practicing idolatry were actually, supposedly practicing idolatry were the Mesopotamians or the Persians. And so there's this tradition that Cyrus actually was called by name by Marduk, okay? And so Marduk is the Mesopotamian god, right? And so we find this on the Cyrus cylinder, is there's this tradition that Marduk called Cyrus by name. And so the Jews see this as idolatry, and they say, no, that's not true. God, our God, called Cyrus by name to bring us back to Jerusalem. And so any references to this type of idolatry is actually, and it's inaccurate. The Jews are wrong about this, but they're saying that the Persians are idolatrous by saying this. And so it's not referencing the Jewish idolatry. Andre, do you have that pulled up?
Dude, yeah, it's so sick. Okay, look. So it's Jeremiah 10. It says, here.
I'll pull it up here too.
Yeah, Jeremiah 10 chapter or verse. Well, I'll start at verse 2. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth the tree," and Alejandro, think of like the processions that go on in those, major Catholic countries. "For the customs of the people are vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, and worketh the hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that they moveth not. They are upright as a palm tree, but they speak not. They must needs be born, like carried, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do nor evil, neither also is it in them to do good. For inasmuch is none like unto thee, O Lord. Thou art great, and thy name is great in thy might. And so it goes on to saying, it says, silver spread into plates from tarnish, and gold from Uphaz, and workmanship, and the hands of the founder, blue and purple is their clothing, and they work of cunning men. And then it talks about the Lord is the true God. But I mean, I just pulled up a picture of it, but it looks like these processions and stuff like that. So it's really something interesting to me that something that like a scripture, we talk about, we've been talking about like the political tensions and things like that, but some things are just timeless. Maybe it was something that was practiced then, but I mean, it's really something that you can look back at now, and it's very likely that he was talking about something completely different, right? But how you can take a scripture and take the context of it and put it in a different context and have it, paint a different picture for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and
go
you
ahead.
bring up a good point, because that's sort of like the direction where Abraham Gileadi, that's sort of like the direction that he takes, is that he's going to make the argument that Isaiah is using like the traditional Jewish form of prophecy to sort of tell forth, but not only for like the contemporary people there, but also for like latter-day people, or people like way into the future.
Dude, yeah, people have been taking Isaiah scriptures and applying them all over the place.
So I mean, that gets to this point about Jesus, right? Right. Right here. Oh, I don't know if I put it here. Isaiah 53 right here, right? So I think Abraham would say, maybe if we analyze this in the historical context, Isaiah is talking about Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, as the suffering servant, let's say. Sorry, not King Hezekiah. He's talking about Israel as the suffering servant. He's not talking about Jesus, right? But it's so metaphorical, let's say. The theme is so evanescent, I think that's the word, timeless, that you can apply it to Jesus.
Would you say the theme or the archetype?
Same thing.
Well, so Galeati, he says type, and so
type of Christ.
So he's getting there. He's approaching that sort of.
Yeah, and I think that's. Sorry.
Can you clean your room, Brandon?
Okay, sorry, that was my mom.
No, you're cool.
Okay,
say hello for
dinner's at 5, Brandon. Dinner's at 5.
Okay, so I'll just say about this. Right, I think the honest way to incorporate exegesis and keep, let's say, this Christian overlay over the interpretation of Isaiah as a Messiah scripture is to say, hey, Isaiah wasn't talking about. He was talking about Hezekiah. He was talking about Israel. He wasn't talking about Jesus or Cyrus.
I'm going to stop you real quick.
We can reinterpret. I have a question.
What do you think, Brandon, about the titles, the headings that we have on the scriptures? What is your opinion?
That's the tradition. Yeah. I think that's the tradition that came down. That's the historical Christian tradition, let's say, is that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. The actuality is...
I'm sorry. I'm talking about traditional, in the Mormon scriptures, in the Mormon standard works that we had Bruce R. McConkie, and I remember who, I think it was Boyke Packer, that they wrote the headings. And so is that setting you up for an interpretation of a scripture? You know how in Isaiah 53, Isaiah 53, it says on the heading, it says,
oh, the LDS. Sorry, you're talking about the LDS scriptures, right?
Yeah, LDS scriptures.
Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, for sure. Yeah. That's eisegesis right there. That's, hey, let's overlay this on our beliefs, right? Yeah. We're not talking about the original context. Let's throw this into the LDS tradition. How are we going to view it with this lens? That's specifically eisegesis.
So what do you think about that?
And so, okay, good question. So I just took this class with Hank Smith, and he is well aware of these biblical problems as he's teaching the New Testament. Let's say he knows that go to, let's say, a biblical Society of Leadership conference and say, we got these two sticks here. One stick's the Bible, the other stick's the Book of Mormon, and they're going to laugh you to scorn, right? Because exegetically, that's not the context. It's talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom being split apart. But he says, okay, we're Mormons, so let's view this from our lens. That's perfectly fine. That's eisegesis. And we're going to say, okay, we have two sticks, and let's represent that as the Bible and the Book of Mormon. But let's not say that that's what Isaiah was trying to, or who is it? Ezekiel? Man, I got my sources
Yeah,
right.
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel? Okay, if it's Ezekiel, let's not say that's what Ezekiel is saying. Okay, let's be clear about that. And so that's kind of the perspective Hank Smith took. And I think that's the most honest, scholarly route you can go as a Latter-day Saints, is to recognize when you're interpreting this through your own lens versus this is the original context. And biblical studies is only focused on the original context. It says nothing about how can you take this archetype, let's say, and apply it here or imply it in your life. And that's a big criticism, I guess, of biblical scholarship would be that if scriptures are made to be living and interact with.
You would say always pretext. Always pretext. If you're saying something out of your own lens, make sure that that's the pretext.
Yeah, be clear about where this is coming from, I would say.
Okay. That's like academic integrity.
Yeah. So I think that all applies here too, right? So if you're going to say Isaiah 53 is about Jesus, then you'd say, okay, that's how I view it with my Christian lens, but it probably wasn't talking about Jesus. Maybe he was unconsciously being inspired by God to do so. Like, you could say that. Fine. That's totally fine in my book, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think Isaiah was consciously talking about Jesus in any of this. That might be offensive, though, to Christians, but not offensive to Jews, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saying the opposite would be offensive to Jews.
And this is just speculation, but I wonder how people would take that before, right? Like in the time of Isaiah, there are these like prophecies or these things that are written down or told among the people by the prophets, and I wonder if they did have like that, they had to keep their integrity, because like obviously that seems like a big theme. Like in Deuteronomy, it says like don't take away or keep or anything like that. But I wonder if there is this sort of like.
Well, here you can see it in the historical context, you know. So this goes back to the historical Jesus argument, where the disciples were always confused. You know, every time Jesus in the book talks about his death, you know, they say, "Hey, what are you talking about, Jesus?" And then Jesus says, "Peter, stand, you know, back away, basically.
Get behind me.
Satan's getting you." Okay, so they when Jesus died, his followers were very confused about how is this the Messiah? Because this whole time we grew up learning that the Messiah was going to swoop in, bring the kingdom of God, save us all from the wicked. Okay, but now Jesus is dead, and so they're having a faith crisis, basically, right? The road to Emmaus, these disciples are walking. Jesus comes up and they say, "We thought he was the Messiah, but obviously not," right? And then so what happens is they go back, they have to look back into their scriptural text, and they have to reread and look for where does it say that the Messiah is going to suffer, let's say. And here is the first time that they identify Isaiah 53, suffering servant. Okay, maybe that's talking about Jesus. Okay, I don't think they're thinking in their mind, okay, academically, was Isaiah actually talking about Jesus here? You know, so they probably don't care too much about that because they're trying to reinterpret and make sense of what is going on in their lives, right? And they've been influenced by this great person, Jesus, and they can't come to terms with how is he the Messiah if he died? And so they have to reinterpret it. I think it's more out of necessity more than anything than of let's go through this as a biblical scholar and say what's accurate or what's original, let's say.
I had heard that they, you know, what I had been taught at least, is that they believed that the Messiah was going to be like this, you know, mighty leader that had legions and things like that, and going to save them from, you know, from bondage from the
yeah, it was very political, right? Just like how Cyrus saved them politically.
Right. That's what and that's how I heard that they were. That's how I was taught that the Jewish community was expecting the Savior to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's pretty accurate.
I wonder, so, you know, do you think that was also kind of out of context, that they would pull things out and they say, this is how I want the Savior to be, and kind of like leave other things out? Or?
Yeah, so in the book that I was talking about biblical prophecy, it's very, very common practice for Christians to retroactively interpret, let's say, Jewish texts in a Christological way. And so they'll read Christ into those old texts. And that's just pretty standard practice for like early church fathers. And so,
although, you know, and that's interesting because they say who was it? They say that all prophets in the New Testament, they say all prophets prophesy of Christ, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and that's exactly what they do. They read Old Testament and Talmudic texts, and then they like Brandon was saying, they apply an eisegesis onto it to support their Christian beliefs. So
they've been doing that since Jesus,
since forever,
Jesus died. Since Jesus died, yeah.
Yeah. So
I don't think before that.
Scholarship.
No. So
that's why like biblical scholarship
is that something
that's why it's important.
Is it not academically, like, does not have hold like academic water for even the apostles?
It depends.
That after Jesus died?
It depends on your like on your assumptions, right? Like if you want to take like an objective like reading to a text, right, and you want to strip away like presumptions and biases and stuff like that, then you have to reject the Christological interpretation of like old texts. But you have to also understand that Peter, James, and Paul were not academics; they were religious leaders, and so their role, they're not trying to be like objective, and academic with their interpretations. They're basically trying to do prophecy and exhort their people.
So my question is, how far does it go? Because now they take things
right, and that's the problem with eisegesis. Is it's an open game.
Well, you take the traditions, right? You take something like the institution of the sacrament, or something like baptism and things like that, and they interpret them as, well, baptism means the death and the rebirth of Christ, and they say that Moses, when he went through the desert, it says it in, I think, is it Acts 10 or something?
Right, the Red Sea.
When he went through the Red Sea, it's a symbolism for baptism.
Yeah. So
do they represent this eisegesis way of thinking onto all things now?
Yeah, we all do that.
And they look at Moses, and he raised the serpent, and this is a symbol for Christ and things like that.
Right.
So is it possible that all these things you're saying maybe in their context were not those things?
Exactly. So I think a biblical scholar would say, yeah, when let's say the story actually took place, it's historical, and Moses raises up the staff, I don't think Moses was thinking in his head, hey, this is Jesus on my staff, and I'm representing him in some very archetypical way. But the biblical scholar would say, I can't say anything whether or not this actually represents Jesus Christ. That's not the role of a biblical scholar as an academic. All the biblical scholar could say is, based on the context of the time, what was likely that figure represented. And he can't comment on what it means to us now. And so that's a big part, I think, of maybe the faith tradition that one holds, is if you want to believe that God was inspiring all of this all along the way, and so from the beginning of time, that Jesus was to be represented by all this. Then
it ties a nice, pretty knot on all of it.
Sorry, what?
It does tie a nice knot on all of it.
Yeah.
Because and you look at things now. We've played the experiment in all of our seminary and institute classes of typifying Christ, right? Yeah. And all things represent Christ. And really, you can look at anything and interpret it to be almost anything, right? You can, because consciously you have the ability to shape reality in the way that fits, right? That does tie a nice bow on things.
And this is an argument made against religionists sometimes. So, for example, the Genome Project, the guy that wrote that book that still believes in God, I think Sam Harris was making fun of him because he was taking a hike and he saw 3 streams from a waterfall. And he said, I saw the Trinity in that, right? And everyone laughed, of course. Okay, but that is how eisegesis works, is that you're putting your view on something.
It's bigger than that. That's how all interpretation works.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Right? And so you can say eisegesis when it comes to the Christians, but the Judaism, they also have their own interpretation. And it's just a way of interpreting, and eisegesis is just the label that we put on Christian 2020 vision, right?
Well, here's the thing, though, with that is, if you're trying to understand the meaning of a text, right, and you're correct in that in the Jewish tradition, they apply their eisegesis into those texts,
ancient Mesopotamian text traditions,
right?
Marduk
but
story.
if you were to then reach the conclusion that that this is like an evidence for Christianity, then the Christian eisegesis that you're discovering in the text is an anachronism. And so if you're going to be objective about it, you're going to say, well, we have to separate these, and then that gives us an insight into what this text meant at the time when this particular audience was reading it. So,
I think that's a very interesting point, and it's something that's been carried on for generations. But I think it's important to point out that even though Christians do it, I think everybody, does.
Oh yeah, sure. Everyone does. And I'm going to go one step further in this direction and say that everything represents Christ, but I'd like to ask the question, what does Christ represent? And I think that's really what Jordan Peterson gets at when he talks about archetypes, is what exactly does Christ represent? And I think
does Jordan Peterson
ultimate potential.
Right, he talks about the ideal, right, and the reason that he can be the judge and the
savior at the same time,
right, and the savior.
Yeah. And so I think that's the actual substance there that is being represented. So sure, Christ is in everything. And I would go so far as to say it's because specifically that the ultimate potential of a human being doing good, becoming, what does Thomas S. Monson say? Become the best person you can become, right? So he has a whole book on that. And that is what is being represented since the beginning of time. And so maybe that would even sound more attractive to an atheist listening to this conversation. I don't think an atheist would be listening to this conversation, but
if there's an atheist listening to this conversation, then listen to Jordan Peterson when he talks about Christ being the ideal, being the judge and the savior. Honestly, it helps to put a metaphor around it. It's really nice. I really like Jordan Peterson's talk.
Right.
Yeah. And then another conversation for another time.
So where were we though? Like we're on this last slide, and I feel like we're almost on to the next slide.
Yeah. So here's let's just go back to this. So the against arguments for multiple authorship, right? So we got first of all, Jesus quotes him and other apostles. Well, maybe they're just quoting the name of the book. We had this other argument about idolatry references. Well, guess what? They're actually talking about idolatry of the Persians. Okay. And then we have this discussion about how idolatry could be some archetypal theme that stretches throughout all the way to 2020. Okay. We have this other argument that why does it all come in one book if it's not written by just one author? And well, here's this break at chapter 33. And also that's 400 years later from the time.
What is this picture? What am I looking at?
This is the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's the earliest manuscript we have of Isaiah. It's dated 400 years after, over 400 years after. Okay, those are the main arguments. There's two other main arguments. So I think this is the bulk of our discussion that we've been talking about, discounting prophetic view. Okay, and I read this quote that talks about it doesn't make sense that a prophet would be saying all this stuff that wouldn't make sense to the people at the time, right? Because even prophets today aren't going to be talking to audiences later. They're still going to be addressing the audience today in some way. Okay, they have to connect it back somehow. And so it doesn't really make sense to say that this is prophecy because it wouldn't have made sense to the people.
Although I have a question. Is it possible that it was something that was just written down and not something that was given to an audience?
Oh, the oral. Yeah, I mean, I almost certainly comes from oral tradition first. I doubt Isaiah wrote. I mean, was Isaiah literate? These questions are very difficult questions for anyone to answer, I feel like.
Right, a note to my future self.
Well, Abraham Gileadi is gonna argue that he was a literary genius, but I don't know if he was a scribe.
Right, because I mean, he was poetic, I guess, right? So I don't know.
Right, so maybe like as an orator, I don't know what the word is, like in his poem. I mean, was just passed down forever.
I wonder if that's.
I think that's more than likely because it's almost always oral history before it gets written down.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Oh, okay. I do have to mention one thing with Kenton Sparks. I think it was him.
Yeah.
I think he's the one that points out the. No, correct me if I'm wrong. It was in the Reason for Faith article that you had posted. In your
Kent Jackson.
Where he talks about. Ken Jackson, yeah, right. Where he points out the that there's a break within the scroll He claims that the break might indicate that like that's where a new section by a new author starts, but it's not conclusive if it was like just a new section or if it was a new author that was starting a new like thematic.
Okay. Yeah, I mean you can make that point.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think David Bockavoy would respond to that and say, well, the whole thing doesn't actually matter that much because this manuscript's 400 years later, so we can't be sure.
Right.
At that point. So.
Yeah. They just took a break. They just took a lunch break and started on another page.
Probably. Yeah.
After 33 chapters of Isaiah. Okay. Did you want to go in more about? I guess let's cover this before we get into the textual literary stuff. So. Isaiah 44. So okay, just read this. So this is kind of the argument that's saying, hey, you know what? This doesn't sound like prophecy. Just read it yourself. Okay, Isaiah 44:26. That saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah ye shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof. So I don't know, ask yourself, does that sound like prophecy to you? Isaiah 44:28. That saith of Cyrus, right, the Persian king, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. So what this is saying here is there's three events, right? There's the event before Jerusalem got destroyed. There's the event that Jerusalem got destroyed. And then there's the event that they go back and rebuild it. And it's saying, does this sound like it happened before Jerusalem was destroyed or after Jerusalem was destroyed? Or after it was rebuilt even, right? And that's the question is, you have to decide for yourself as you read this. Does this sound like prophecy to you? Or does this sound like a description of foretelling?
It could also be commentary, to be honest, because with Cyrus, obviously a redactor included Cyrus. Well, okay, it's not. You can make the argument either way, but it's very likely that a redactor added Cyrus into the Isaiah text in 44 because Cyrus wasn't around when the actual Isaiah was around. And so this sounds like it could be commentary that was included by a redactor into the text. And that goes back to the other argument where, it was written by a single author, but then edited by a redactor, which disrupts the unity of the text, but is not necessarily like authored by 2 or 3 authors. So that to me sounds
my question would be, what would you?
It sounds like a prediction to me.
Right, this is speculation, but if you were to argue the new Mormon apologetic way, what would you say Isaiah wrote in place of here, I guess? And what would, because it's changed to this now, but what do you think the original text would be? Like, use your Urim and Thummim, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I understood the question, but.
So, because if you're saying that it's possible that the scribes later edited, like, so they added in this name Cyrus, right? But Isaiah did write the essence of this, but he didn't write this specifically how it comes out now. And so my question is just like, I ask this more out of curiosity. Sorry?
They took it from the 23rd Psalm.
From the 23rd Psalm? What do you mean?
The Lord is my shepherd.
Oh, right here. He's my shepherd. Okay. Yeah. And then, so I mean, I was just
but Brandon, what are you trying to get at though? That's where I'm losing it. Like,
what I'm trying to get is I'm trying to imagine what the original would be, right? If it was edited.
I think on Fair Mormon, they say it was probably a messianic type meant to refer to the second coming of Christ. And that's what Cyrus replaced, the word Cyrus.
The foundation.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that would make sense. Yeah, because I like.
Oh, Jerusalem, thou shalt be rebuilt. Okay, yeah, the scattering, gathering.
Yeah, and because if you have redactors and scribes like applying eisegesis to an older text, I could see it being very probable that there was like a generic sort of title, like Justin was saying, for like a Messiah type, and then as this sort of unfolded. Congruently to their history with Cyrus and being freed from Babylon, they would go back, redact it, insert, scratch that out, insert Cyrus's name, and then
kind of like I'm not trying to say anything negative, but kind of like how the Jehovah's Witness do. They put Jehovah in for Lord all the time.
Yeah, I mean that's a parallel. Yeah, because with the Jehovah's Witness Bible, for sure they are applying their eisegesis into the whole text, and they take it to the extreme. But yeah,
right, but we're also editing the text when we're adding to the text when we add that little here's what this chapter heading is.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly too. Yeah.
And footnotes too. I mean, that's also
and footnotes, right?
Right. And I actually had this whole question on my mission. It was like, well, is the footnote accurate? Because before it said that Alma died, but then now the text only says that he probably died, but it doesn't say he actually died, and they changed it later. And so I would say even the LDS Church would say, but yeah, the footnotes and the chapter heading are not doctrine, but
it's a study help.
Definitely. Yeah, I would say that. Yeah. I think that's going to be the most expansive apologetic argument.
I mean, the footnotes, they really do open a lot of doors. Like you can go back and compare, because Jordan Peterson talks about how it's a reference, how like each scripture references
hyperlinked text.
As a hyperlinked text.
Sure.
So footnotes help a ton.
Yeah. I think we grow up thinking of it wrong though when we say, oh, the King James Version is the one and only, and those chapter headings have been there since the test of time. You just have to think about where
like
they
the
come
80s.
from. They actually come from B.H. Roberts and McConkie, I think, and other people. But
how long have they been there? I think since the 80s, right, or something. Since the 80s, or.
If B.H. Roberts was involved, it would have been earlier. But they've gone through many editions. So that's Isaiah 53. So this is an evangelical argument. They would say, hey, if you say that these predictions don't sound like predictions, then you're dismissing the entire thing about Christ being the Messiah. And the thing that you can walk straight around this argument is that Christ was 500 plus years down the road. So it could be the case that they had already rebuilt Jerusalem, and he's still prophesying about Christ, right? So you don't have to deny prophecy of Christ to accept multiple authorship of Isaiah. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I got it.
So those are the main arguments that I just summed up.
It was 1979, really.
Oh, since the latest, when they added the chapter headings?
The footnotes and chapter headings, yeah.
Okay, so pretty recent. So maybe B.H. Roberts had nothing to do with it. Okay, this is where we get Abraham Gileadi. So
okay, yeah. So I'm gonna try and do it in a nutshell. So since we're
can I just introduce Abraham real quick?
The man I've been waiting for.
Because he is instrumental. I think he is a very credible scholar. He's a Mormon. He was excommunicated in the September 6th. Accidentally, pretty much. They accidentally put him in.
They literally reversed his excommunication.
They reversed. So he's back. He's a member. He stays down low. He doesn't really comment a lot.
Wait, did you say that they like accidentally put his name into the mix?
Not really accidentally, but like he didn't belong with the other five. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. I was gonna say, yeah.
He wasn't like being critical, really. He was doing scholarly work. He was doing higher criticism, or not higher criticism. He was doing textual criticism of the Book of Isaiah, and this is part of his work. I think this comes later, though, but he's a serious Isaiah scholar. He's taken pretty seriously by others, so he's not just some LDS apologist, let's say, in my books. But that's kind of the introduction of him. I wouldn't agree with his arguments, let's say, but let's go into that.
Okay, so part of his work is he's written several books on Isaiah, and he is unique in that he sort of comes up with his own. He does a few things that are sort of unique, but one of the things that he does is he comes up with what he calls a bifid structure for the Book of Isaiah. What that means is that the Book of Isaiah, instead of most scholars split it up into three like thematic and periodic sections. Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. What Gileadi does is he says, no, it's a bifid, it's a two-part section. And what he does is it's literary, right? So it's not historical. It's more like it's more literary, and it's more like prophesying in the sense of forth-telling, telling forth rather than foretelling and fortune-telling. And what he said, and what he points out is within each bifid, right, within each half, there are what he calls, I think, 6 or 7 pillars. And what those are is there are like certain types or images, like the suffering servant. And when he argues is that these types have like a parallel type in the next bifid. So, for example, in one section there's the suffering servant, and that's a parallel to the tyrant. And there's the messianic sort of king, and then there's the Davidic king, and those are parallel. And he argues that
the two sections.
Yeah, so in one section it presents one type, and then in the next section it presents a parallel.
Is he
type.
dividing section like 1 through 39 and then 40 through the rest then?
I can't remember. I can
The judgment and the savior, like two different.
Kind of, yeah.
Judgment,
like
judgment and mercy. Yeah, judgment and mercy. Right.
Yeah, and I can link the paper. My computer's so slow I can't pull it up right now.
Is that the one you sent us in Messenger?
Yeah, that's the BYU.
The review of his
work. Yeah, and so what he argues, he says, okay, so Isaiah is he's arguing that Isaiah is using a bifid structure that presents several types, and then those types are paralleled in the next section, in the second section. Therefore, the work, the Book of Isaiah is one unitary literary work that is not necessarily historical, but like prophetic and literary. And so it doesn't address things that are like in the immediate. Well, it does address things that are relevant to their time frame, but it's also like a latter day prophecy, and he uses those types to allude to those. And so it answers questions like, if there are 3 sections, why would we include them as one? And so Galeotti answers that question by saying, because the reason why we include it as one is because it maintains the parallel between the types that he presents in the first and the second section. And then 2, no, I think that was that was it.
I have a question though.
Okay.
Was it during the compilation of the Bible? Is that when they decided this is going to be one, or what do the scholars seem to think?
I don't know. Well,
I think for Isaiah it must have been earlier than that.
Yeah, because I don't think Isaiah has ever been presented as 3 separate parts ever. It's always been presented as one part.
I mean,
right,
when you say as ever, like we can agree post 308.
Okay, yeah. Good point.
Because the argument here is that Abraham is trying to say there's no pseudepigrapha here. He's trying to say that nobody came and said, hey, I'm going to pretend to be Isaiah to get my point across, right? And my point across is Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah. He's saying, no, that was all Isaiah originally.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So what do you think? I mean, that seems like an argument against the multiple author, right?
Yeah.
They have to take that, and they have to say, there is pseudepigrapha here. It wasn't all Isaiah. And who are these other guys? I think that's a big question, right?
Yeah.
Or what is
it? So
we talk about how there's a title for the name for what is it? Shoot, what's the name of the title that Elijah? No, Elijah? That's a title name? I don't know. That like Elijah will come, and how we talk about how Elijah is also a title and it's a name?
Oh, Elias.
Elias. There it is, Elias. So is there maybe this idea as well that maybe Isaiah is the teller of the future, or the prophecy teller? And so multiple people can take that name.
Oh, I see. Well, first of all, biblical scholars would not agree with the LDS kind of apologetics that Joseph Smith got Elias right, because it referred to. And so they wouldn't make any. I don't think they would make that claim for Isaiah either. Normally, what happens is because you see this with New Testament scholarship, which is much closer, and we have more texts, right? And so when we find that there's pseudepigrapha for something like 2 Timothy, right? Because Paul writes 1 Timothy, and it sounds like Paul, but then 2 Timothy, it doesn't sound like Paul. We can say with certain probability that that's not Paul, but we can almost never find this is Paul's student, let's say. We can't come
Yeah.
up with any conclusion like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've always actually had that question because I heard Lucas was the one that wrote part of the Acts.
Luke wrote Acts. Whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts, likely.
So,
Yeah.
and that's the question. Like, we have these names for these books, and it's like, how do we know who actually was the guy behind it?
Right.
Yeah.
What
And it's almost impossible to know if it's not Luke that wrote Luke. Then it's almost impossible to know who it actually was. All we can say is, it probably wasn't Luke. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the
And maybe that's a
argument that
weakness. I don't know.
the argument that Galeotti is making, he's saying, look, if there's this, he's saying first there's a bifid structure. Two, there are parallels between the first bifid structure and the second bifid structure. Therefore, if Isaiah was written by multiple authors, it's very, very, very improbable that the two other redactors conform to that bifid structure. It just, because it's so hard. It's so hard to get two authors to be on the same page, let alone three authors. So he's saying it's more likely that Isaiah is one author, Isaiah. You then have to, then the next question is, okay, what do you
I don't understand though, Alejandro. Is he saying it's more likely because the tradition has been that way? Because it's come down the funnel that way?
What do you mean by it's come down the funnel that way?
Why can't Abraham Gileadi imagine that, hey, there was this first portion and then pseudepigrapha was committed, because we have evidence for that all throughout the Hebrew Bible, and then it came down as multiple authors, I guess.
So he's saying that because of the bifid structure that he discovered in Isaiah, it's very unlikely that the two other redactors that they're writing fell into place and created this bifid structure.
Oh, so he's saying that
because there are parallels.
Yeah,
he's talking about these parallels, right, that exist within the Book of Isaiah.
And so for the Book of Isaiah to be congruent, they need to follow the same
Well, he's saying what he's saying is there's this bifid structure, that there are these parallels, and that makes it like a coherent unit, and therefore it's unlikely that three authors, as they added to the Book of Isaiah, it sort of created a neat little bow and
the thing
finalized the. Go ahead.
But
look,
you don't think
the thing about that is,
have a bow?
I feel like, because a biblical scholar says, hey, we have two different themes, right? Judgment and mercy. It's likely that these are two different books, right? And he's going to say we have two different themes, but the fact that it comes wrapped in a bow as one book says that, hey, these are probably from the same author. I feel like he's kind of like he's using the same evidence by just looking at literary themes, but he's making the opposite conclusion just because, I guess, I don't see any real substance of evidence here. It's more like he's using the same evidence.
Because I guess from what I'm understanding about the theory is that the whole purpose of the book is a juxtaposition, right? He's taking the book and just comparing two things. And so if there were more than one author, then it most likely wouldn't make the juxtaposition. It would just be something different.
See, but why couldn't he focus on one theme, and then later people come out with an oral tradition or transcribing, and they come out with this juxtaposition, let's say, and then that gets taken down later on in history as one book? I don't see why that wouldn't be possible.
So I suppose that's I'm not saying that's not a possibility.
Or I guess why would Gileadi not see that as probable?
I think what he's saying is, hold on, let me think. I just had the thought. I think what he's saying. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Just go ahead, Brandon.
I was just thinking, you have the Hebrew Bible that's kind of like this is a really, really stereotypical analysis I'm going to overlay it with, but the Hebrew Bible kind of seems like a Old Testament angry God almost, and then you have this merciful God in the New Testament, but they're not the same authors. There's millions of authors there, but that's kind of the way I'm viewing it.
Oh yeah, he makes a good point. That's a good point, Brandon.
So I think with Gileadi's position is that so basically what you're saying, Brandon, is across three authors they were able to create a bifid structure and then parallel and then the second half parallels the first half across three different sections across three different time periods.
So maybe when it comes to general,
because that sounds like to me that sounds like a really like the probability of that. It sounds like a stretch to me. Like,
see, okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So he's saying this isn't just a coincidence, but I would say two things. First of all, my first question would be how does he know that his interpretation of this juxtaposition is correct? Let's say, and second of all, or it's to the extent of which he wants to overlay it. And the second question is, how does he address all of these bullet points that Isaiah 1, Isaiah 2 through 5, 6 through 12, 13 through 14, 24 through 27, and 36 through 39, and 34 through 35 seem to be later redactions, if not totally. Because it's not three authors, it's multiple authors, more than three, is actually what scholars argue.
So I think he would lean on the idea that it's one unified author, and then redactors came in and disrupted or put in edits, right?
So he would give the edits. Okay.
Yeah, that's I think that's the approach he would take. So,
but I think that weakens his argumentation, right?
Well,
by
not
allowing
necessarily
for later edits.
Well, yes and no, because every biblical text has been edited by a redactor, right?
But here, why would people edit it, right? Why are these people going back and editing it?
Because language changes.
Well, no. Well, in the case of like the historical edits, right? People have redacted into Proto-Isaiah things like Cyrus. Wait, is that the case? Is Cyrus mentioned in
Proto-Isaiah? The redactions here, it's pretty specific stuff. I have a link to the article. It's going to be this article.
Yeah.
But I don't have the specifics on the top of my head right here. It's going to be this. I can't remember. It's one of these David Bokovoy articles. I actually might have not linked it, but yeah, that Cyrus is going to be in the Deutero-Isaiah.
Deutero-Isaiah. Okay. So, what was the original question? Why would people edit it? Is that what the question was?
Right, because I just thought of one. I believe Babylon is mentioned in Proto-Isaiah, and so if you were to say, hey, he obviously predicted Babylon or whatever, almost everyone agrees that Babylon couldn't have been there. They added.
Is it Babylon or is it Ariel?
I can't remember where Ariel comes into play in this.
I thought Ariel was in 29, Isaiah 29.
Oh, was it 29? Well, let's see, 29 is not even on here. Either way, there's a bunch of redactions of stuff like that. So my question was, why are people redacting it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So that could be. I can't refer to what Gileadi said because I didn't read what he said about that. So I don't know what Gileadi would say about that. But from what I'm thinking of is, generally speaking, biblical texts, people apply their eisegesis into it in historical manners. The Cyrus one is a good example, I believe, where people, like, a redactor goes in and they put into the text historical things that they thought were relevant at the time, like Cyrus and Babylon. The argument that Gileadi makes is that he uses certain imagery. He takes certain imagery and uses those as types to make like latter day and almost like apocalyptic type prophecies that are like way into the future. And so he's not really. I guess the argument that Gileadi is making is that Isaiah didn't like specifically prophesy specific events like Cyrus or Babylon, but perhaps that those were redacted into the text after the book was written.
Right. So I think that would be like what we talked about, the New Mormon apologetic for this.
Something like that.
The essence of it was single authorship, but it's been redacted along the way.
And so the strength of Gileadi's theory lies in the literary cogency of the text rather than like the historical redactions into it. So he's saying as a literary work. Go ahead.
I guess that would be his weakness, right? Is he's ignoring the historical context, and he's only looking at literary context.
Yeah. The book is called The Literary Message of Isaiah, and he's saying, as a work of poetry and literature, this is one coherent thing. There perhaps were corruptions in the text by redactors or people trying to edit them, right? Eisegesis that scribes applied into the text. But he's also saying that makes the text unified, and it's very unlikely that it was a coincidence that there's this bifid structure and that it parallels itself within that structure.
I see.
And as a literary work, it's a unitary work.
Okay.
But I see the other side of the argument, like, because when people redact things, right? For example, the Bible is just a great example. The story of Jesus Christ, when you add it to the Old Testament, basically answers or parallels the fall, And so, as these redactors do their eisegesis, it resolves itself. And I suppose you can make that argument with the with Galeotti's thesis, but I don't know how he would respond to that. But that's another perspective you can take.
I mean, I think that's good to have Galeotti's argument or kind of his framework there, because someone who wants to view this as not anachronistic would have a somewhat a scholarly thing to lean back on. Where I would say this doesn't really resonate so much with me is because the nature of biblical scholarship is that, as I've been explained by some biblical scholars, is that you have to have the source criticism, and that's kind of the higher criticism, versus the lower criticism, which is the textual and the literary analysis. The higher criticism sort of trumps the lower criticism, and those are actually two technical words that they actually use. Because of that reason, is because it does, the evidence of them talking about desolation and waste places being rebuilt, that just seems to be stronger, to me at least, and biblical scholars, than any type of thematic juxtaposition would show for a single authorship. And so that's where it's going to differ for me, I guess. I think
I think that's valid.
Yeah, I think the stronger point that I was expecting from Galeotti was kind of this mention of linguistics, the different words that they use. So, for example, here's just a quick example. The word David is found like 700 plus times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's shown in this form, 3 letters in the early times, and it's 4 letters in the later time. Right. And so you can actually point to this specific Deutero-Isaiah, let's say, chapter 55, where they use this early version spelling of David. And so that kind of seems like a pretty strong-ish argument to me, like stronger than, I would classify that as higher than.
Because it results in anachronism, right?
Right. Because that would be an anachronism then. But I double-checked this. It's only referenced one time, though, so.
Okay.
So it's a curiosity, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of this one needle that's holding up the whole haystack. But that's kind of, to me, constitutes as stronger evidence. On the other hand, of course, David Bockvoy argues that, hey, well, you've got all this Aramaic influence in Deutero-Isaiah. How did they know that? Because Isaiah didn't speak Aramaic, right? That came, I don't remember, 300 BC-ish, it started forming. But so I think I would say that linguistic evidence or literary analysis would be inconclusive, just because there's the Aramaic argument on one side, and then there's the David and kingdom. The word kingdom is used differently, and also all the things that Galeotti points out in his article. But then I would say, then you go to the higher criticism, and it's pretty decisive on this side. That's kind of my conclusion.
Well, so I know that Galeotti does do a higher criticism, but his book is divided into certain sections, and he has an index where he goes into the higher criticism and the word choice and the grammatical patterns. That I guess someone who takes the position that the Book of Isaiah is authored by several people. He basically criticizes the assumption or the argument that it has. Well, basically what I'm trying to say is his textual analysis reaches a different conclusion than the people who believe it's been authored by multiple people. So we'd have to look at that specifically, because he lays down his methodology, his statistical stuff, and how he comes to that conclusion. So, and I apologize to everyone right now if I am not presenting Galeotti's position as strong as he could have, you know.
We'll have to have him on the show.
What did Moroni said? These are errors of men. Don't belittle.
If there are any errors, it's the error of Alejandro.
So yeah.
Okay, perfect. I guess that was good. I think it's good to have these different kind of, I guess, going back to this slide, right? To have these different types of views that you can have as an LDS scholar. To me, Grant Hardy's really, I think, is the most honest in that he says, you know, this is a difficult problem and I can't solve it, so I'm not going to try. David Balkavoy actually, since he's the one who presented most of the evidence I showed you here, he actually says that my recommendation for a faithful Latter-day Saint taking in this information is to say, basically what Nephi says is, you know, I know that God loves me and that's about it. I don't know what's going on here. And so I'm not going to worry about it because it doesn't affect my faith that is grounded in, not in historicity, let's say, but it's grounded in the effects and the transformative power of religion, I would say. And I just put a bunch of words in his mouth. But that's basically what he was saying, how I interpreted it, is that let's not worry too much about the historicity of the Book of Mormon here. Let's focus on what the Book of Mormon can do for you.
Which ultimately is what you want, which ultimately is what Jordan Peterson says. You know, he says, I act as if God exists, which is my definition of belief. So do I believe in God? I guess. No. Yeah. You know, and I think that's a big message to send people is, you know, if you are looking for change, dude, religion is a good way to do it. It sets your ideal at a place. It can be a means, you know, it can be a means to better your life. But I think at the same time, for me at least right now, it's an end, right? My ideal is so far ahead of what I can achieve in this life that it is something that I can look forward to, right? That I can say, I want my trajectory to be this. I want my goals to be this and that, because it's something that, you know, maybe I don't know all things right now, maybe, and especially, you know, I don't know many things right now, but I can at least keep a structure for, you know, in order to achieve this, you know, and it's been a good way for me to really press forward, I think.
Beautiful. Alejandro, did you want to conclude anything?
No, I mean, we really covered it. I think, like, we really went through not everything, but more so than most people. So I'm really happy with how this turned out.
I'd be surprised if there's another presentation that's this comprehensive within the LDS faith on this problem. So that was fun. I guess I left this last slide because it's an interesting comment on a Wheat and Tares article that really, because a few people have managed to deal with this problem from an LDS perspective. And generally the argument is that, you know, it's kind of inconclusive, so let's not worry about it too much, in favor of Book of Mormon historicity. And so this comment was from a guy that said, hey, you know, we've been talking about the Book of Abraham a lot, and where does that fall in place, you know? Because I feel like there's a lot of evidence against the Book of Abraham historicity. And so what does that tell us about the Book of Mormon being likely to be historical? And so I just think that he makes a good point in connecting the two texts and not separating them into two isolated vacuums. And that's why for me, it's still necessary to do as Andre was just talking about, is that we have to separate historicity, let's say, from faith. and they can't overlap in the way that we've been raised to have them overlap. And so, yeah, that's why I threw that one in. I guess if you want to look at any of these sources, they're all included in this PowerPoint, so they'll be uploaded and attached probably somehow in a Google Doc that you can reference from the podcast description. But
Dude, thanks, Brandon, for having us on.
okay,